Hi, I'm Todd Kelly from Kelly Racing. Now that these Mustangs are finished, welcome to the very last episode of the Road to Mustang. We've been able to have a pretty good week here back at the shop from Adelaide, and we're very fortunate that one, the cars had really good reliability and they both came out of here straight. So the guys had a much deserved few days off. Now we're back into it in preparation for the AGP here in Melbourne. There's a few things we need to tidy up on the cars, not a lot considering how much work was done, just a few little wiring things and just being able to take the time to make all the panel gaps really nice and the cars a little bit more presentable than what they were at Adelaide. The big one though is getting the engine sorted out. So let's go in the engine shop and have a look at where we're at. The biggest job by far in this whole project was definitely getting this engine built and developed in time for our first round. All in all, we're actually pretty happy with it. The guys instantly had really good feedback, Rick and Andre, from a driving point of view. It showed it had pretty decent power on the dyno and it also looked to run pretty good on the track around other cars. So we're quite happy with the performance of the engine, but there are a couple of little things that we need to go back and tidy up. So the first thing is the fitment here around the billet throttle body blade in the runner. So you can see there's a slight little gap around the edges, so we didn't have a lot of time to really perfect this as much as we would have liked, and as it turned out there's just a little bit too much air that can get round the edge of the butterfly when it's fully closed, which means the idle in the engine is too high. You wouldn't think that that might be much of a problem, but it actually is, because if you get to a certain point in a race car, it can actually push the car on into the corner when you're off the throttle and cause the drivers a bit of a problem. So it did actually do that on our first outing, and the only way we could fix that without redesigning and remachining these parts is by pulling some ignition timing out of the engine to kind of artificially get the idle back down. So that fixed that problem. Unfortunately, that made the car stall every time they pulled up hot in a pit stop during the race. So we're right in the middle of tuning this drawing up in the CAD model and making new parts to get that seal nice and tight. You can't obviously go too tight because any little catching there will cause the throttle to stick on. So it's a bit of a balancing point, but we're just sorting that out now. But we can get through the next few races, and now that we're aware of the issue, make sure that the drivers keep the engine alive in the pit stops and then the idles back far enough not to cause them trouble on the track. So that's underway, but the big one is getting some weight out of this thing. Back in the old days of supercars, there were nowhere near as many rules as what we have now. There was really only a minimum car weight. Nowadays we have minimum piston weight, rod weight, front axle weight, actual car weight, engine centre of gravity, height. So in the old days there was a huge incentive to get all of the engine parts as light as possible. So you'd machine as much excess material off the head as you possibly could, and you'd do the same thing on the engine block. As things have evolved over the years through cost cutting and trying to get more control over those things in the category, there's been rules put in place to stop all of those things. But the rule for the minimum engine weight on this Ford block and cylinder head is actually quite light. So not machining the head or the block, which we didn't have time to do before building the engines, we've ended up around 15 kilos too heavy with our engine. That might not sound like a lot, but given that the car is also on minimum weight, that's transferred into an extra 15 kilos of front axle weight, which is far from ideal in a handling perspective when you're trying to get round the corners and brake the car and be competitive against the other cars. So that's our big focus now with the engine. You may have seen in an earlier episode, we had to machine the side of the port here for the push rod clearance that goes from the rocker down to the camshaft. So that is really only 1 or 2 millimeters thick between the port wall and that push rod clearance. That's not a problem because we know exactly where this port is because it's all in a CAD model, and we could machine that part and know where that is. But in an actual casting, there's lots of little galleries in here which are cast into the cylinder head and also the block for oil and water to go through. So the one thing that's quite common in any cast part is a thing called core shift. So as the part gets made, there can be slight variances in where all of those galleries end up and the wall thicknesses all around the different areas of the cylinder head and the block. So we can't just go mowing all that material out assuming that the core is in the right spot, because you could actually go through and break into water or oil, or just end up too thin in the wall and have a failure. So there's quite a lot involved in getting educated on the tolerances of all those things in the cylinder head and also the block. So you can see in here there's lots of places where you think you could just pull material out, but it could weaken it and you could get close to one of those jackets. So there's a fair bit of work to do to go around and measure all of the different areas that you possibly can and get as much knowledge as you can to take the material out in the right spot.
Hi everybody, I'm Gio from Kelly Racing. What we're doing here, we are validating the thickness in the engine block because we need to remove some material. So we need to make sure that the thickness that we expect to be is actually what it is. So when we go and remove material, we don't go into the water. So the way we're going to do it, we're going to use some conventional measuring method, or we're going to use this ultrasonic thickness gauge, as you can see on this side, to validate where the thickness is, if it's where we expect it to be, or if it's smaller or less, and then adjust accordingly. So what you can see on this side, we made a little grid of 9 points. And what we're going to use these 9 points, which we know because we measure where they are, and we're going to measure the thickness in all these 9 points and validate through compared to our CAD model to see if they are thickness-wise where we expect them to be or not. Unfortunately, there is no other method for us to measure the thickness of the casting in this position, so that's why we have to use this ultrasonic method. And as you can see, we're only doing this 9 points grid as an example for you guys, but we're going to measure the whole surface of the block to validate the thickness. Okay, so we just finished measuring up this engine block, and the consistency of material between the two sides is very consistent. So we measured 9 points per side, and we are very happy with where we are at the moment. So everything is consistent with the CAD model, so full steam ahead we can continue.
It turns out the centre of gravity that we've landed on with our engine is pretty right. So we need to make sure we take the material off in the right areas, not to upset that and then have to put ballast in another part of the car. So it's quite a big job, and certainly something that you don't want to rush into, but at the same time, we don't want to be driving around too long with that 15 kilos over the front of the car. So that's underway. There's one more thing I wanted to do before we wrap up. Let's head back into the workshop. So before we wrap this video up, I really want to introduce you to all the people that have been involved in this project. There's been a huge amount of effort put in, as you saw through the series, and also a lot of sacrifices made by all these people standing behind me to achieve the amazing feat that we did. So I'd like to introduce you to the whole team, starting with the machine shop here. We've got Brenton, Rob, Kaylin and Sam. Those guys made a huge amount of swarf and a lot of good parts that have ran extremely well on the cars. Our fab department, again, a lot of welding and sparks flew in there. We've got Ed and Ben, and sub-assembly, Mikey and Ed. Our engine shop has done a huge amount of work as well. We've got Sean, Kai and Tone. And once all those parts were made, it was really down to the car crew. They did a huge amount of work right at the end of the program. So we've got Maddie, Ray, Jamie and Dylan. Those guys did an awesome job to get the cars together as they did last minute. Then our composite department, you saw all the parts that those guys made, especially on the engine and the ducting side. So we've got JD, Stretch and Adam. And then the crew that designed all of this stuff, which is a little bit smaller now that we've gone back to a 2-car team, but we've got Phil, Gio, Nath and Dylan, and right at the end here, the main men, we've got our team manager, Matty House, did probably more hours than anyone on this project. Winnow, our workshop manager, and our commercial team, Brooke and Lauren. So thank you to all of these amazing people for what you've done, and thank you for watching.